On January 25, 2026, at precisely 20:14 in the afternoon, Dorothy Shelton sat in a lawyer's office in Ada, Oklahoma, and signed a document that would detonate her family like a bomb buried beneath generations of soil. She was 81 years old, sharp as a thorn, and utterly certain. But the ranch she was signing away wasn't just land. It was the original Shelton family homestead, the acres where her husband had proposed, where her children had learned to ride, where the Oklahoma wind had carried 4 generations of laughter and grief across fields that remembered everything. And she was leaving it not to her famous son, not to blood, but to Kelly Clarkson, a woman who shared not a single strand of DNA with the Shelton name. And the reason, leaked later by her own attorney, would cut deeper than any legal clause ever could. There is an irony in Dorothy Shelton's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The mother who raised a son on that red Oklahoma dirt, who watched him become one of country music's most beloved voices, who stood proud at award shows and smiled through cameras. The woman who believed family was everything, who preached loyalty like gospel, who never once wavered in her devotion to the Shelton name. All of that, so that life would arrive 8 decades later and force her to choose between blood and belonging, between the son she birthed and the daughter she chose. How does a mother reach the point where she signs away her legacy to someone outside her bloodline? What breaks inside a family so completely that a Ring doorbell camera captures a grown man screaming at his own mother? What happens when the person who was supposed to be temporary becomes permanent, and the one who was supposed to be permanent becomes a stranger? And perhaps most devastatingly, what does it mean when a mother looks at her own child and whispers words that will haunt him forever? To understand all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, to rural Oklahoma in the early 1940s, to a young girl growing up in a world where land was identity, family was survival, and loyalty was the only currency that mattered. To a woman who learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the people you raise are not always the people who stay. Dorothy was born in a small farming community where the Depression's shadow still lingered in the creases of weathered faces and the careful portioning of every meal. Her father worked the land with hands that never fully healed from labor. Her mother stretched pennies until they screamed. There was no luxury in that house, no softness, no margin for error. You worked, you survived, you kept your word, and you never, ever abandoned your people. She married young, as girls did then, to a man named Richard Shelton, a quiet farmer with gentle eyes and a stubborn streak that matched her own. They built their life on that ranch, the one that would become the center of this entire story. She buried 2 children before they could walk, grief that carved itself into her bones, and never fully left. She raised the ones who survived with fierce, protective love, the kind that sometimes suffocated because it was terrified of losing again. Her son Blake was born in 1976, the baby of the family, the one who came after the losses, the one she held a little too tightly, because she knew how easily children could be taken. She watched him grow tall on that Oklahoma land, watched him discover music, watched him leave for Nashville with dreams bigger than the sky over Ada. She was proud, impossibly, achingly proud. But she was also afraid, because she had learned early that the world takes what it wants, and fame is a particular kind of thief. When Blake's older brother Richie died in a car accident in 1990, something in Dorothy calcified. The loss confirmed every fear she had ever carried. Family was fragile. Family could shatter without warning. And so she held tighter to what remained, even as holding tight began to feel like clutching at smoke. She watched Blake marry Miranda Lambert in 2011, watched the tabloids dissect their relationship, watched the divorce in 2015 unfold like a public execution. She watched him marry Gwen Stefani in 2021, watched the glamour and the distance grow simultaneously. She watched her son become someone she recognized less and less, a man who lived in a world so far from Oklahoma soil that sometimes she wondered if he remembered where he came from at all. Years later, Dorothy would confess to a friend, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. "I raised him to remember his roots." But somewhere along the way, he started thinking the branches were more important than the trunk. The breaking point didn't arrive with fanfare. It accumulated slowly, like sediment in a riverbed, until the weight of it changed the current entirely. Blake's visits became shorter, then rare, then perfunctory. Phone calls that once lasted hours became texts sent by assistants. The ranch that had shaped him became a place he mentioned in interviews, but rarely touched with his actual presence. And Dorothy, who had survived buried children and a husband's death and decades of watching her son become a stranger in designer clothes, began to realize that blood was not, after all, the guarantee she had always believed it to be. The irony was almost poetic. Blake Shelton had become famous singing about small towns, about family, about the values of rural America. He had built an empire on authenticity, on being the good old boy who never forgot where he came from. But his mother sat alone on the ranch that had made him, and she wondered if the man on television was a character her son played, rather than the person he actually was. And then Kelly Clarkson walked into the story, and everything Dorothy thought she understood about family began to shift on its axis. Kelly Clarkson arrived in Blake Shelton's orbit through The Voice, that spinning chair spectacle where famous musicians pretend to discover talent they will mentor for precisely one television season. They became coaches in 2018, and what began as professional banter calcified into something neither of them expected: genuine friendship. The kind that survives beyond cameras, beyond contractual obligations, beyond the transactional nature of Hollywood relationships. But it was what happened off-screen that caught Dorothy Shelton's attention. When Blake's marriage to Gwen began showing cracks that publicists couldn't plaster over, when the glossy facade started crumbling in ways that fame couldn't fix, Kelly didn't disappear like so many industry friends do when the shine dulls. She showed up. Not with cameras, not with statements, not with the performative support that celebrities deploy like currency. She showed up with casseroles, with phone calls at 2 in the morning, with the kind of presence that costs nothing except time and everything except convenience. Dorothy first met Kelly in 2023 at a family gathering Blake had reluctantly attended. The older woman watched this famous singer, this powerhouse voice, sit on a porch swing and ask genuine questions about Oklahoma history, about the ranch, about the family recipes Dorothy had never written down, because she assumed someone would always be there to learn them by watching. Kelly listened like the answers mattered. She laughed without performing. She helped clear dishes without being asked. It was such a small thing, Dorothy would later reflect. Clearing dishes. But in that small thing lived a universe of meaning. Blake's previous wives had treated the ranch like a photo opportunity, a rustic backdrop for carefully curated authenticity. Kelly treated it like someone's home, because she understood that homes are sacred, even when they are not your own. Over the following months, Kelly visited more than Blake did. She called to check on Dorothy's health, sent handwritten notes that arrived in actual mailboxes, remembered birthdays without social media reminders. When Dorothy had a health scare in early 2025, a cardiac episode that hospitalized her for 9 terrifying days, Kelly flew in from Los Angeles. She sat in that sterile hospital room, held Dorothy's weathered hand, and talked about nothing important, because sometimes presence is the only language that matters. Blake sent flowers. An assistant arranged them. The card was typed. Dorothy would later tell her attorney, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was confessing. Kelly showed up when my son fell apart. Blake's exes took. Kelly gave. It was a summation so brutal in its simplicity that the lawyer reportedly set down his pen and looked away, as if witnessing something too private for professional presence. The decision to change the will didn't happen overnight. It germinated slowly through 2025, watered by every missed call, every delegation of familial duty to hired help, every moment Dorothy realized that proximity and presence are not the same thing. She consulted her attorney in November, drafted the documents in December, and signed them on that cold January afternoon with hands that trembled not from age, but from the certainty that she was doing something that could not be undone. She was leaving the original Shelton ranch to Kelly Clarkson with a letter explaining that legacy is not about genetics, but about who carries forward the values that make a family worth preserving. She hoped Blake would understand. She suspected he would not. The news leaked within hours, because nothing stays private when famous names are involved and legal assistants have social media accounts. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the story was spreading across entertainment news with the velocity of digital wildfire. And by 3:14 p.m., exactly 1 hour after Dorothy signed the documents, Blake Shelton's truck was barreling down the dirt road toward his mother's house, trailing dust and fury in equal measure. What happened next was captured by Dorothy's Ring doorbell camera, a piece of technology her grandson had installed for safety that would instead record the precise moment a family detonated. The footage was leaked within 24 hours, viewed millions of times, analyzed frame by people who had no stake in the pain they were consuming like entertainment. Blake's face was contorted in a way his fans had never seen, the off-fable country boy replaced by something raw and wounded and terrifying in its intensity. He stood on that porch, the same porch where he had taken his first steps, where his father had taught him to tie his shoes, where generations of Sheltons had gathered to watch Oklahoma sunsets paint the sky in colors that seemed to exist nowhere else on Earth. His voice cracked across the footage, desperate and accusatory. "I'm your blood." And Dorothy, framed in her doorway, small but immovable, delivered the response that would haunt every headline for weeks to come. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "Blood abandons. Kelly stays." 6 words. 6 words that contained decades of disappointment, hundreds of missed moments, thousands of small abandonments that had accumulated into this single, devastating verdict. Blake stood frozen, a man confronting the mathematical sum of his own absence. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned, walked back to his truck, and drove away from his childhood home for what might have been the last time. The Ring camera captured his taillights disappearing into the Oklahoma dusk, and something about that image, a sun leaving, red lights fading into darkness, carried a symbolism too heavy for words. Dorothy closed her door, leaned against it, and did not cry. She had made her peace with this moment long before it arrived. The tears, if they came at all, belonged to someone who still believed things could have been different. Kelly Clarkson learned about the inheritance the way everyone learns everything now, through a notification on her phone, a text from her publicist containing a link, and a single panicked sentence. She was in her Los Angeles home, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of single motherhood, when the news arrived like a grenade thrown through her window. Her first instinct was to call Dorothy, but the older woman's phone went straight to voicemail. Her second instinct was to call Blake, but she knew that conversation would require more than a phone call could contain. Her third instinct, the one that would define how history remembered this moment, was to do absolutely nothing until she understood the full weight of what had been placed in her hands. For 6 hours, Kelly sat with the knowledge. She read the legal documents her team procured. She studied the history of the Shelton Ranch, the generations it had witnessed, the blood and sweat and tears that had soaked into that Oklahoma soil. She understood, perhaps better than anyone outside the family could, what Dorothy was really trying to say. This was not about real estate. This was not about money. This was about legacy, about values, about a mother making a final, desperate attempt to teach her son a lesson he had refused to learn any other way. Dorothy was not giving Kelly a ranch. She was giving Kelly a responsibility, to model what family actually means, to show Blake what he had lost by losing sight of what mattered. At 7:03 p.m., Kelly Clarkson posted a statement that would redirect the entire narrative. No publicist wrote it. No legal team approved it. It came from somewhere deeper than strategy, from the same place that had made her show up at Dorothy's hospital bed, that had made her call on ordinary Tuesdays, that had made her remember birthdays without reminders. Her words were simple, stripped of celebrity polish. "I can't take what Blake needs, but I will manage it for him." The internet, predictable in its hunger for conflict, didn't know what to do with grace. The story had been so perfectly constructed for outrage: famous son disinherited, outsider woman rewarded, family torn apart by jealousy and abandonment. Kelly's response didn't fit the narrative. It was too measured, too mature, too focused on healing rather than victory. She didn't claim the ranch. She didn't reject it entirely. She offered to hold it in trust, to manage the property, to preserve what Dorothy wanted preserved, until Blake was ready to understand why his mother had done what she had done. It was, in essence, an offer of grace extended to someone who had not asked for it, by someone who had every right to simply take what was legally given. Dorothy saw the statement from her living room, the same room where she had nursed babies and mourned losses, and watched her family grow and scatter like seeds in wind. She smiled, the kind of smile that carries both sadness and satisfaction. She had chosen well. Kelly understood. But the story was not finished weaving its complications. At 11:47 p.m., a new thread entered the narrative, unexpected and somehow inevitable. Miranda Lambert, Blake's ex-wife, the woman whose divorce from him had been tabloid ammunition for years, reached out to Kelly Clarkson with a proposal that would transform this family crisis into something larger than any individual grievance. Miranda offered to buy the ranch from Kelly for $4.7 million, significantly above market value. But her intention was not profit or spite. She wanted to convert the property into a women's shelter, a refuge for domestic violence survivors, a place where the legacy of the Shelton name would become synonymous with protection rather than abandonment. The suggestion carried layers of meaning that only those familiar with the history could fully appreciate. Miranda had spoken publicly about difficult experiences in previous relationships, though never specifically about Blake. The shelter would serve women who had been abandoned by those who should have protected them, a mission that echoed, perhaps intentionally, the very wound at the center of this entire story. Kelly didn't respond immediately. The offer was generous, the intention was noble, but the complexity was staggering. This was no longer just about a family ranch. It was becoming a statement about legacy, about redemption, about what we owe to each other when blood fails and chosen family must carry forward what birth family cannot. At 20:14 a.m., precisely 12 hours after she had signed the documents that started this avalanche, Dorothy Shelton spoke again. Her statement was relayed through her attorney, carefully worded, but unmistakably hers. It was the kind of verdict that only comes from someone who has lived long enough to understand that endings can also be beginnings. She said, "Kelly manages. Blake learns. My legacy is safe." In 4 short sentences, Dorothy had restructured her family's future. The ranch would remain under Kelly's stewardship. Miranda's money would fund its transformation into something that served the broken and abandoned. And Blake would watch from the outside as 2 women he had once been close to collaborated on preserving what he had neglected. It was, depending on your perspective, either a masterful act of maternal tough love or a devastating final rejection. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the most important lessons always carry the sharpest edges. Blake Shelton received this news alone in his Nashville mansion, a property worth 15 times his childhood home, filled with awards and platinum records, and all the evidence of success that ultimately measures nothing that matters. He read his mother's words on a phone screen, in a house full of expensive silence, and understood that he had finally run out of excuses. At 7:03 a.m. on January 26th, Blake Shelton posted 3 words that captured the devastating absurdity of his situation: "Homeless in my own hometown." He had checked into a hotel in Ada, Oklahoma, the town where everyone knew his name, where his face smiled from murals and welcome signs, where he was simultaneously the most famous person for 50 miles, and suddenly, painfully, a man without a place to belong. The irony was almost unbearable. Blake Shelton owned properties worth tens of millions of dollars. He had ranches in multiple states, mansions that appeared in architectural magazines, vacation homes he visited once a year, if at all. But the one piece of land that actually meant something, the soil that held his father's memory and his brother's ghost, and every formative moment of his childhood, now belonged to someone else. Not because he couldn't afford it, because he hadn't earned it. In the hotel room, surrounded by generic furniture and the particular loneliness of temporary spaces, Blake reportedly made phone calls that went unanswered. He drafted texts he never sent. He stared at photographs on his phone, images from the ranch, from childhood, from a version of himself that existed before fame rewired everything about how he moved through the world. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, according to friends who spoke later under condition of anonymity, he began to understand something he had successfully avoided understanding for decades. He had become exactly what he had always feared becoming. He had become his father in reverse, not a man who stayed and worked, and was present even when presence was difficult, but a man who left and succeeded and justified absence with achievement. He had convinced himself that providing for his family financially was the same as being there for them emotionally. He had confused giving money with giving time. He had mistaken fame for connection. The days that followed were not kind to Blake Shelton in the public eye. Social media dissected every aspect of the situation with the gleeful cruelty that defines modern discourse. Think pieces analyzed his failures as a son. Former classmates from Ada gave interviews about who he used to be versus who he became. The narrative solidified into something almost mythological. The country boy who forgot his roots, the singer of family values who abandoned his family, the American success story that proved success and goodness are not the same thing. But something was shifting beneath the surface of public consumption. Kelly Clarkson began quietly meeting with local organizations about the shelter project. Miranda Lambert transferred the first installment of funding. Dorothy, despite her age and her cardiac concerns, started reviewing plans for how the ranch could be transformed while preserving its essential character. 3 women, connected through one man but united by something larger than him, were building something meaningful from the rubble of a family explosion. And Blake, stripped of the ability to buy or charm his way out of this situation, was forced to reckon with a question he had avoided his entire adult life. What kind of man did he actually want to be? The answer didn't come quickly. It came in fragments. Over weeks of reflection and therapy sessions, he would later acknowledge publicly. It came in handwritten letters to his mother that were returned unopened at first, then read, then finally responded to with cautious, conditional hope. It came in conversations with Kelly that were not about the ranch or the inheritance, but about something more fundamental: what it means to be present, what it costs to truly show up, what we owe to the people who loved us before we were worth loving. By February, Blake had begun visiting the ranch again. Not as the owner, not as the heir, but as a guest in his own history. He helped with the shelter planning. He donated quietly, without press releases. He sat on the porch with his mother and said things that should have been said years ago, words that arrived late but arrived nonetheless. Dorothy watched her son learning, finally, the lessons she had tried to teach him through every other method available. She watched him becoming someone she recognized again, not the celebrity, not the brand, but the boy who used to help her in the kitchen, who used to sit on this same porch and dream about things bigger than himself. She would not live forever. She knew this with the clarity that comes only to those who have made peace with their own ending. But she had done something more important than simply continuing to exist. She had found a way to transform her death, whenever it came, into a final gift, the gift of forcing her son to become the man she had always known he could be. Today, the Shelton family ranch stands at the beginning of its transformation. The main house is being preserved exactly as Dorothy designed it, a museum of sorts to the values that built it. The surrounding acreage will become the shelter Miranda funded, a place where women without homes will find refuge on land that taught one family, painfully and publicly, what home actually means. Kelly still manages the property. Miranda still funds the mission. Blake still learns, every day, how to be present in ways that don't come naturally to someone who spent decades being celebrated for leaving. And Dorothy, at 81 years old, sits on her porch some evenings and watches the Oklahoma sunset paint the sky in colors that exist nowhere else on Earth. She made a choice that most mothers never have to make. She chose accountability over comfort, tough love over easy forgiveness, legacy over lineage. From the mother who buried children to the woman who rebuilt her son, her story is proof that love is not a feeling but an action. And sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to accept less than someone is capable of giving. What would you sacrifice to teach someone you love who they really are? How many times have you shown up when showing up was inconvenient? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of those who transformed heartbreak into healing. Because in the end, as Dorothy Shelton taught us, all blood may make you related, but only presence makes you family.